Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for that welcome, a true Scottish welcome. It's nice to be back, actually. I first came up here in Graham Hill's day and remember being entertained splendidly, as indeed I have been this time. So thank you, Vice-Chancellor, for that dinner last night. Excellent. I also mentioned to him, of course, that having been a Vice-Chancellor for 19 years and retired about a year ago, I now find myself wishing to be 20 years younger and starting out on what it must be a really challenging time for higher education. Lots of opportunities, more opportunities perhaps than there have been in the last 20 years. And I'll explain why I believe that to be the case as we go through. So I'm afraid I'm going to take, and you can boo if you wish, pretty much an English perspective on this, because that's my background. And I'll try to remember to put it into the Scottish context as I go through. But whatever happens in England will have a bearing on what happens in Scotland, and I think we all know that. And it's just a question of how the two organisations, the two countries essentially go forward from here. So that's enough of a preamble. So my contention is that English and Scottish and Welsh higher education has been very successful over recent years, and we have driven down effectively costs, we've improved quality, and I'm going to illustrate my contention in a number of areas as we go through. And I'm going to use a key, and it's very much a personal key. So any bullets that are green are, in my perspective, good news. If they are neutral or indifferent, they're in the amber, and if they're bad, they're in red. And you can judge for yourself the balance as we go through as to what those look like. Begin with a slide that should be very familiar to you, the growth in UK entry to degrees from 1960 onwards. And we had an elite system down here with less than 5% of the population going to university, and now we're sitting up at around 45% in England, and similar figures in the devolved administrations. The very rapid increase here, of course, is the redesignation of the polytechnics as universities. So that's not, if you like, a real increase, it's a classification increase. But nevertheless, the trend has been strongly upwards, particularly more recently. Now, are we satisfying demand? Well, you could argue that we are, because look at this figure here. This is the ratio of applicants, the people making the applications, to acceptances for degree courses only over that period. And we've dropped from around 2 applicants for every place down to around 1.2-ish now. So we're beginning to saturate the demand. And I'll be saying much more about whether my take on whether that's going to increase or reduce in the light of the Brown recommendations that were published last week. So the system is actually getting to a large proportion of the population. So success in teaching, and I think there have been successes. It's grown dynamically, as that last graph showed, particularly since 1990. In the main, graduates still get better jobs than non-graduates. Thank goodness that's true, otherwise we wouldn't have a very good marketing position. Graduate pay remains on average above non-graduate pay. So both the quality of the job and the pay for it are better. And we are still attractive to international students. Whether that will remain the same if there are massive changes to the visa arrangements and the numbers of international students that are allowed in or to stay to do research remains to be seen. But at the moment, I think we can say that's a true statement. Teaching quality assessments that we've had over the years confirm the quality of education across the whole of the UK. So what are the challenges? Well, the lifetime earnings premium, that's fallen markedly. When I was arguing on behalf of the Russell Group back in 2004 for tuition fees to be introduced in England, then I was using a figure of around 400k as the lifetime's earning benefit from having a degree. That was a genuine figure, it was accepted by all parties, but that figure now is being quoted as 100k. Actually, if you dig a little deeper, you'll find that it's not on the same basis. The 100k that's talked about is net of tax. It's a net benefit rather than the 400k, which was a gross benefit. So they're not directly comparable, but nevertheless, the politicians are using the 100k figure, which is markedly less attractive as an incentive to do a degree than 400k was. At 400k, it was a no-brainer. The benefit you were going to get was enormous. Now, with the expansion of the system, rapid expansion, of course, now feeding through into that lifetime's earning estimate, it's not quite such a good return, particularly if the costs rise to, shall we say, 30 or 35k in order to get the degree. It's a 3 times return. It's a pretty good return, actually, on your investment, but it's not quite as clear-cut as it used to be. Graduate unemployment is rising, particularly in some areas, which will feed through, of course, into choices, I would imagine. Average graduate debt is rising in real terms. So actually, the students are taking on more debt, some would say, than they need to, and I'll illustrate that in a moment. And of course, we see a lot in the press about, is it a good return if you do certain subjects where the contact hours are very short? So is it good value for money? Now, students increasingly, with encouragement from the press and some vice-chancellors, see themselves as customers. Now that of itself is not a bad thing, but you mustn't carry the analogy too far. So it's a different world that we're going into, rather than in the 60s where it was an absolute privilege to be going to universities, and the idea that you were somehow a customer, you received from the great and the good the wisdom spittled down to you through the lecture theatre, whereas now I think students say they test what they receive in the way of lectures, tutorials and so on. So it's a market system. Now I mentioned about the students' debt. Well, I thought I'd show you this, and I have failed, I'm afraid, to update this. This is about a 2006, I think, graph. NatWest produced an annual survey, and I failed to be able to get hold of an updated version of it. I know they publish it, but if anybody has a copy, I'd love to find what the latest one is. But this, with that caveat, it shows how student expenditure split in that 2006. So the point I want to draw out of this is this other bit that I've coloured yellow here, compared with the things you would expect to be there: rent, food. Notice that you need food to eat, but we'll come on to what's over here. Clothes, books, transport. So essentials, if you like. My classification that those are essential items. Look at this. Alcohol, phone calls, cigarettes, going out and eating out, separate from food. So this is, if you like, discretionary expenditure. That's significant, isn't it? So students are willing to take high loans, more loan, in order to live as they would expect to have lived perhaps at home. Now, I'm sure the NUS might challenge that, my understanding of that, but the figures are from the NatWest survey. So there are, go back again. The figures are quite stark, aren't they? I mean, for me anyway, I thought that was a lot, and one inevitably compares with one's own youth and going to university. The idea that you would go out and eat out was perhaps pretty exceptional once a term, maybe. Alcohol, okay, hands up for that. Yes, we did spend quite a bit on that. But phones, of course, not. You'd be lucky if you got to the local phone box and put your 4 old pence in. But cigarettes, I'm sure, were there as well for some. But the pattern of expenditure has changed significantly. So we need to think through what will happen in the future in relation to that pattern of expenditure. Will they continue to want the best accommodation? Just anecdotally, at Birmingham, we used to sell, if you like, the student accommodation that was the most expensive first. We had a range of accommodation with some deliberately unrefurbished accommodation that was cheaper. That sometimes never let. So the cheaper accommodation was left empty, the most expensive filled first. Now that's an interesting dynamic, isn't it, about student experience, what they want from universities. So the higher education environment, again, my perception of this, I think we've been driven by league table mania, and it's wound up by the press and our dearly beloved Times Higher as well. that we tend to focus our strategies on those league tables. And that's a bit strange, really, and perhaps a little perverse. There's been, and the QAA organised meeting, I hesitate to say this, but a threat of publication of summaries of external examiners' reports. Not that I would worry at all about things being said about my past institutions in the public domain, but it will change the nature of the external examiner's report. If you publish it, it will become more anodyne. So I'm not entirely sure that that's a good thing of itself. It would be better, in my opinion, to have the sharper remarks, but privately, rather than public remarks that are meaningless. So, more private universities are in the wind, and I think that's a dangerous misclassification, because it assumes that present universities are part of the public sector. We are not. Institutions have independent royal charters in the main. They are not part of the public sector. They can award degrees in their own right, they can charge fees in their own right, notwithstanding the fee regime, and I'll say more about that in a moment. But we must resist a view that we are like enhanced schools, that the Secretary of State can say to the universities, do this. Now, there have been levers in the past where those levers have been quite effective. Going forward, at least in England, there is perhaps a likely change in the strength of those levers. I'll explain more later on. So, more for profit higher education institutions. We see them growing. There even some universities are contracting their work to them, to actually encouraging them. So there is a real threat there, perhaps less of a threat if Brown's proposals are adopted. Now, of course, university title, and that's controversial. I won't say too much about that because I don't know exactly who my audience is in terms of where you come from. But there is a danger if university title, and particularly not having research degree awarding powers, proliferates too much. It changes the definition of university. Now, it doesn't undermine anybody operating in higher education, but for me, the word university has certain connotations about being at the cutting edge, driven by a research environment behind that for the staff. I know that's controversial, I'm sure somebody will ask me a question about it. And, of course, we've seen an ongoing debate about the honours classification system. And we'll see where that one takes us. Every 5-10 years there's a report, and we all say, yes, yes, good idea, and nothing happens. And, of course, at last, market supplements and rewards for the best teachers. It's been a long time coming, but we are now starting to see that happening. But if you actually compared absolutes, research still gets the high rewards rather than the teaching side. Now, starting to come a little closer to and a little sharper, publicly panned higher education funding, and this is based on Universities UK paper and endorsed by the DFES, as was. And you can see the divergence, as we know, since the introduction of tuition fees back in '97, when it was a £1,000 upfront payment, and the subsequent changes in 2006 to the actual payment. So, interestingly, here's what the public purse is paying for, and effectively that's the effect of the private contributions from individuals. I think you know what's going to happen in England to that shape if Brown's proposals are accepted. This line effectively goes to jolly nearly zero. All that's left in there are STEM subjects that would be supported by the teaching grant, and of course correspondingly we hope that this will go up. But have a look at the figures, because this funding per student, there's the £7,000, which is the figure that's mentioned in the report. Brown is suggesting £6,000, and you start paying tax beyond that to discourage you from charging more than £6,000, because he thinks that we can operate more efficiently at around £6,000. Now, that's pretty much where we were at the point at which tuition fees were introduced originally. Now, that would worry me. In quality terms, that really does worry me. My contention is that there is a connection between how much you spend per student and the quality that you can deliver. And you can howl in protest if you like, but based on a career in higher education, that's my contention. There is a coupling between expenditure per student and quality that you can achieve. So, if we now look to postgraduate side, the number of postgraduates, of course, in the UK, across the UK, has increased significantly over recent years. Now, we have seen fluctuations by country, and Scotland played a blinder, I think I would call it, when they offered visa arrangements for students to come in undergraduate and postgraduate. So that really stole a march on the rest of the country and was markedly successful in attracting international students. The number of overseas postgraduates has also been steadily increasing, and the industry-sponsored courses has shown a marked increase as well. Now, that is really good news. It shows that universities are working with industry and commerce, and they're particularly successful in shortage areas, and you have a very successful department here in electrical power, and they've been really good at setting up links with industry. So that effectively more money comes into the system, students see a guaranteed job effective at the end of it, it's win-win for all parties involved. So nuclear is another area, and there are lots of others I could have cited there. And of course we had the Roberts report, somewhat dated now, but it did show that there was a correlation between a postgraduate qualification and increased salary return. It was a good return, particularly for STEM subjects. What are the challenges on the postgraduate side? Well, the cost of postgraduate education, as we all know, is very substantial, both directly in the cost of fees and in lost earnings. So we've seen that, hence the growth in postgraduate taught and CPD opportunities within universities to try and offset some of that course. So can that be sustained through an economic recession? We'll see. PhD research, my observation, that's actually less attractive. You talk to really good undergraduates in their final year, likely to get firsts, and they don't immediately see postgraduate study as something they want to do. And it may be, and they cite fewer rewarding opportunities. Academia not recruiting as many people as it used to. Industry saying that doctorates are not appropriate for their recruiting situation. Now, of course, another factor that will have started from 1997 onwards is accumulated debt. So as undergraduates find that they graduate with that debt, the prospect of taking on more debt in the form of lost earnings and postgraduate tuition fees is a big disincentive. New visa responsibilities for universities are going to place heavy loads on our administrations. And the consequences of getting it wrong on your international student recruitment could be very serious. So they're quite draconian punishments if you fail to implement the new visa responsibilities. So let's hope nobody falls foul of that. Of course, it could also restrict our total numbers. And of course, other countries now are gaining advantage through offering English-speaking courses. There are plenty of those in the near continent, and they are attracting students, which must be coming away from us in North America. Now, rolling back the clock to the Aichi Act in 2004, can we see any changes from that? Well, very positively, extra income through increased tuition fees. Thank goodness it came. Our staff were underpaid at the time, we were underinvested, estates needed to be reinvigorated. So absolutely just in the nick of time. I think all the rhetoric that went around the argument at that time that we must have more money into the system was absolutely right. It wasn't just crying wolf, it just came in time. Of course, there are significant costs of bursaries and scholarships to universities, which were mandatory. So about a third of the money is estimated to be going back out again to students from the tuition fee that came in. So it wasn't all win, 2/3 roughly was extra income. Now, of course, some institutions that have been well above the offer benchmarks have had to spend more money to try and satisfy those benchmarks. Now, you've seen the offer reports that are not actually terribly encouraging. Not a lot has changed, the recent report that came out. But money has been spent on that that's going away from direct teaching. Others with a weak market position have been spending more on marketing and other incentives for students to come to that particular institution. So again, money going out that's not frontline education. Now, there used to be, when I first became a Vice-Chancellor, a concordat between universities not to advertise undergraduate provision. Well, you'd have watched the television most times around application times and you'll see that's well and truly breached. So effectively, universities are now spending money on advertising. Now, I really do hope that we don't go any further down that road, because that is money straight off the teaching side. So I think there ought to be other ways of doing that, and the concordat was a sensible situation to have developed. Right, well, we can also say positively that despite the predictions of many, applications didn't fall following the introduction of tuition fees in 2006 in England. That actually numbers went up. Counterintuitive, I know, but they went up. And they went up not just marginally, but quite significantly. So the question will be, if Brown is adopted in England, will the same happen? I don't think so, but I'll come back to that. So much of the extra income we got, where's it gone? You analyse it, most of it's gone on pay, on academic pay. Long overdue, because academic salaries had really badly slipped. They are now very competitive, and long may they stay that way. Now, turning to expansion. Well, in my view, the politics of expansion is changing. That if Brown is adopted, we will move away from micro-control of numbers by a funding council. And that would apply to all of the regimes. So remember that, and I can speak with feeling about the English funding council's control of this, there was a ratchet mechanism that you got marginal costs going up, but when you wanted to go down, you lost full equivalent funding per student. So you couldn't easily manage your numbers downwards. And that stopped institutions right-sizing. Birmingham, I'm sure, and it's a matter of historical record, actually wanted to reduce its student numbers. It's a big institution, and we wanted to concentrate on quality and not on quantity. It was impossible for us to reduce our student number, just financially unacceptable. So with the Brown proposals, you can right-size. Not every institution is going to suddenly want to increase in size. Institutions will choose where their strengths are, how big they want to be, what their revenue base is to support the staff that they have. So right-sizing will be much more feasible, at least in England. Now, of course, we've heard a lot about the target towards 50%, currently 45% in England. Are we going to saturate? I think that we shall see a reduction in demand if the Brown proposals are adopted in England. What that will do for Scotland, and we can come back to perhaps better in the discussion, but there will be an effect on what England does and what happens in Scotland. Either you're going to get hundreds of thousands of English students wanting to come up here, or it could be that the changing number arrangements in England mean that effectively you're undercut, but we'll see how that goes. So extra student numbers, as there have been in recent years, have tended to go in for strategic intervention. And nothing wrong with that. That's what limited numbers have been used for, funded numbers. Now, will there be a shift towards foundation degrees delivered in further education colleges? Probably, actually, because why? It's cheaper. So that there will be a drive to do that rather than push more and more higher cost students through universities. And of course, we've already seen lots of statements, government support from the previous government, about support for e-learning and 2+2 arrangements. So different modes of delivery that are all essentially cheaper. and visa changes I've mentioned. So more private provision, including from universities themselves. Now you might be puzzled by that. What does it mean? What I mean in that is that it's perfectly possible, and has been for ages, for universities to have partly privatised facilities. The lever that has stopped universities going private has been the conditions of grant, such that if you charge a single student more than the regulated fee, that is a home or EU student, more than the regulated fee, you lose your entire teaching grant. Now, once there isn't much teaching grant, that's not much of a lever. So that universities actually might well say it's better for us to go private. But why I mean that they could have done it in the past is because you can have a subsidiary company, wholly owned, educational charity registered, covenanting the profits to the host institution, and that is a private operation that is outside the funding council conditions of grant. That has been possible. People haven't done it in the main because of the political risk, not because it's not financially feasible. Now, change the arrangement where the grant is there, and the politics changes as well because of effectively a drive towards privatising universities. The climate changes, we might well see more toes in the water, testing part privatisation for certain courses. We remember that universities are private already for everybody other than home and EU undergraduate students. That's the only area where, if you like, it's state controlled. So what about staff rewards? Well, thank goodness staff in universities have seen big increases in pay following the tuition fees. And extra money was effectively found in Scotland as well, even though you don't have tuition fees. I would say staff workloads have increased dramatically over the last 10 years. Jolly glad that I was an academic at the lower end of the scales 30, 40 years ago. I think the pressures on academics now are very considerable. Have to be very precise about your career and what balance you want and how you're going to go about it. Not of itself a bad thing, but the workloads don't give you much time for thought. Of course, assessment of staff, both internally and externally, has increased. It's a much tougher regime, I think, than it was when I was a young lecturer. Corporate behaviour, more difficult to engender. I think you did have a sense of pride in your institutions before. I like to think it's there now, but actually when you drill down, then you can find sections of your staff, not necessarily academics, where they don't feel part of a particular institution. So we need to be very aware of that as university vice-chancellors, what the staff morale is like. Promotion is increasingly driven by retention. That is an observation. I can't prove that, but that's my experience, that it is. If staff are being poached, you try to retain them. And that actually is mostly successful. But of course it leads to inflation of salaries in certain areas and for certain activities, mostly research. Recruitment of staff is, in my view, again, increasingly more difficult. Getting high-quality staff who are highly motivated, I think, is actually quite difficult. And, of course, average academic staff age has been going up, although, on the positive side, USS has a positive cash flow, and long may that continue. As a pensioner, it's really essential that USS remains solvent. But that is actually quite an important factor, because, in my view, the changes to USS that are working their way through the system at the moment are regrettable. I thought that actually the better solution would have been to increase the contributions and maintain the final salary scheme as a better solution to actually cutting out final salary scheme and going to a career average. A personal view, I think people would have paid to actually retain a final salary scheme. We shall see what the consultation reveals. And of course we know that the REE has driven up pay differentials, but principally for research. So that's on staff rewards. What about the legislative framework? Well, over the last 10 years we've seen a raft of new legislation, particularly in the fields of anti-discrimination. And I'm only going to list a little bit of it here, but some of it is still working its way through the system, that has very big implications for the way universities operate and the costs of the administration itself. So anti-age discrimination, refinements in pension, working time regulations, and the positive duty to promote equality in race and disability. So all of these things are not bad in themselves. I'm not trying to suggest they're bad. It's just that the administrative burden of doing them is very significant for institutions. So we've seen also a massive increase in the number of cases that find their way to employment tribunals. And we have to think about whether we've got out of kilter now between the protection that was provided under university charter and statutes for staff, well ahead of where national legislation provided that protection, is now in conflict or unnecessary in relation to the law of the land that has caught up essentially with where universities were in terms of staff protection. So there is also a potential threat to institutional autonomy, in my view, from the proposed new fee cap regime, where we've got a soft cap. Now you might say, well, how do I get to that conclusion? Well, it's about whether a university is free to set its own fees or not. And for all the universities I've worked in, their charter and statutes are absolutely clear on that the universities set their own fees. And it's only the funding council conditions of grant that stop you from doing that. And if we're now going into effectively a market-driven system with fully variable fees uncapped, and you start to have a piece of legislation that stops universities charging certain levels of fee or taxes them for doing it, that is a direct change to the way in which the Charter and Statutes operate. It's not a condition of grant, because as I've tried to explain, it's a weak lever. But if they pass legislation to actually effectively control university fees, you've lost your autonomy that was enshrined in your Charter and Statutes. So watch this space. I'm sure there will be a strong lobby to try and prevent that from happening. And what other influences might we look at? Well, I think the employment framework within which we operate needs a major overhaul. I touched on it in relation to the law of the land and the protection in charter and statutes. So I think perhaps the only way of doing that is to look at our own charter and statutes and see if we can avoid some of the duplication. Because effectively, from a university management perspective, and I'm sure I won't be a unanimous view in the room, but in terms of a university management perspective, that you do need to be able to change the staffing distribution according to the demand for courses. And at the moment, that is quite difficult to do because you have these two sets of legislation to go through. So it's double protection when obviously was necessary when they were introduced. The law of the land gives that protection now. So at the moment we've got double jeopardy, which means universities move slowly. And my contention is that universities are going to have to move faster. If England goes effectively private under the Brown proposals, responding to the way in which your student numbers fluctuate is going to be absolutely critical. If you're an institution that sees falling numbers, you cannot afford to stay with the staff complements that you have at that time. You have to move quickly. That's not a characteristic I would normally associate with universities moving quickly in relation to staffing matters. So that's going to mean, in some institutions, a revision of the Charter and Statutes. Now, we all know what happened in the Model Statutes times back in '88, hugely complex and highly controversial, difficult, but my contention would be it's necessary. Otherwise, we will find institutions going rapidly out of business because they cannot respond fast enough. So, taken together, if you were an HR professional, you would say life is going to get very busy but very challenging, and there's a lot of pressure there. So I'm sure university HR departments will expand. And I'm afraid I regard some of the comments that we've heard more recently about public sector pay as inappropriate, and with universities coupled into public sector pay, that we are not public sector bodies and we must resist being badged as essentially fully government funded. Birmingham, when I was there, was 29% of our grant came from HEFC only, 29%. For some institutions it's lower than that, for some it's a lot more. But to have the minor shareholder, if you like, telling you everything that you should be doing has struck me for a long time as being inappropriate. But if Brown is adopted, the state contribution will drop significantly, and therefore we may be able to shake off the idea that somehow we're enhanced schools under direct control of the Secretary of State. So, strategic choices for institutions. Can we continue to support a system that allows the demand for places to determine the provision and the deployment of resources? So what is actually happening at the moment is 15 or 16-year-olds are choosing their GCSEs, and that subsequently restricts their A-level choices, Scottish Highers, and that effectively means that they are determining where universities move because of that demand. So universities then staff up to actually meet that demand because they want to recruit students, and therefore effectively running through that determines our research capacity. So because we staff up to meet the demands where 15 and 16-year-olds are choosing, we end up putting more research capacity into those areas where that student demand has increased. That's not terribly strategic, is it really? From a UK perspective, that's not a strategic choice. That is simply a response to demand that has, when the state is funding a lot of the cost, then it seems inappropriate. You should actually be more strategic in what you're trying to achieve. So that just summarizes that point. And if we were in a totally free, unsubsidized market, responding to demand would be absolutely natural. It's what companies would do. But there is, I would contend, a taxpayer interest, even if they reduce the amount of money that they pay. So what is best for the country? What do we need from our higher education system? And there have been many conferences on that topic alone. So shouldn't, as we go into cutbacks, and despite the announcements that we've had, there are still cutbacks, remember, it's just they're not quite as bad as we thought they were going to be, so that's why we're all celebrating. But shouldn't those decisions actually be taken in the light of an overall high-level strategy for the country? Now, that's not a criticism of any government, of any complexion. That is just a statement of fact that there isn't such a strategy. You know, show me the document that actually says, for example, where our research council should be going. Each research council has a strategy, and as I chair SDFC, I know we have a jolly good strategy. It's not formed in relation to a national strategy, because there isn't such a strategy. Whether there will be in the future, we shall see. But as we're cutting back, it's really important to know what you're trying to achieve, rather than just allow free-for-all to happen, and not to be deploying what little resources are left to best effect. Okay, coming to the consequences of the Brown proposals, I think there's going to be a marked change in the demand pattern. Now, you can say, well, it didn't happen last time. On the other hand, last time I didn't argue that it was going to change markedly, because the £3,000 tuition fee in England was a relatively small proportion of the total cost. Now, the English proposals could actually be a significant change. The cost is proposed to go up very significantly, and if the soft cap operates, could be really significantly, such that people will consider much more actively the total cost of the fees as against the lifetime's earnings. So I predict that there will be a big change, and it'll be subject dependent and institutional dependent. So it could be a major threat to the existence of some courses. And again, a prediction, arts and social sciences will perhaps come under the biggest pressure on that. More difficult, not impossible, but more difficult in some areas to show the connection with lifetime's earnings. The change in institutions will not be uniform. Some institutions will be under extreme financial pressure, and that's likely to lead to mergers, acquisitions, and even closures. So going to be a very dynamic and dog-eat-dog sort of world that we're heading into if the proposals are accepted. Not all institutions, as I've tried to illustrate anecdotally, will want to expand. So don't assume that everybody's pushing, therefore, rapidly to expand. What's proposed in the Brown report are essentially controls on the student numbers through UCAS points, which is interesting, and I need to think a little bit more about that. I'm not totally convinced that that's going to work, but the attempt is to control the total student number via a quality threshold. not the distribution pie between institutions, which was, of course, what the funding councils used to do. So I think there's going to be a need for an agreed basis, and it's important that it's an agreed reporting basis for earnings, lifetime earnings. Otherwise, you'll get institutions floating all sorts of figures that are not on the same basis when they talk about, come to this university, your graduate employment will be X and your lifetime earnings will be Y, and they'll all be on a different basis. So I think we need fairly quickly to pin that one down. I think UCAS was talked about as doing it. Actually, HESA collects the longitudinal data, so it's probably more logical that that's HESA that does it. Graduate debt will rise steeply, and therefore demand for courses could fall. I hesitated to put will fall, but I think it probably will fall. And of course, accreditation of professional courses will be even more important. People will be looking for that security that an accredited course gives, that it's recognized as a profession and will lead to exemption from certain professional qualifications. So accreditation of professional courses is even more important than it has been. So has the proposals in the Brown report done enough to protect strategically important subjects? Well, the threshold starts at STEM subjects and goes up from there, and the grant that's retained, the teaching grant that's retained, is for STEM subjects, so medicine and engineering and science and so on. But is that enough to actually, because they will face the £7,000 tuition fee in England, even though they're going on to they're doing STEM courses. So will that depress demand even more than it is? I don't know the answer to that. It's just a worry as an engineer that actually engineering has had some difficulties in the past with a lower fee. Isn't it going to get worse when it's a higher fee? But anyway, we shall see. What about financial aspects? And I'm conscious I've only got 5 minutes left. We should beware of doing more with less. Remember the 1990s, and I was a new Vice-Chancellor in 1990, and I remember a conversation as a young lad being told by my elders and betters that take the extra students, Mike, the minister said that the money will be made available next year. It's just they're a bit strapped at the moment and haven't got enough, so we took the extra student numbers. A bit odd, it's a bit risky this, isn't it? Next year, we went back to the department and they said, still a bit strapped, sorry about that, haven't quite got enough money. Just take some more numbers, you'll be all right, we'll see you're all right. By the time it got to the third year and the same answer came, I think we'd learned we'd been had. And at that point, it was too late because there was a ratchet mechanism in place. You could not, at that point, reduce student numbers, even though the funding, and remember the graph I showed you, was dropping like a stone at that point in time. You were barely able to keep up with the extra student numbers coming in with the staff that you were able to recruit. It was a very difficult time. So learn from experience, though beware of doing more with less. In fact, actually, if you were a company, you might suggest doing less with less, not more with less. It's a better business response. If the customer can't afford to buy your product, do you give them that product and then charge them less for it? Not terribly good business model. So, university borrowing is going to increase even more sharply than it has been doing in recent years. That's a real worry, because that's how universities get into deep financial trouble and go bust, could go bust. Capital projects are going to be the easiest ones to cut, and we've all seen the small print, I think, in relation to yesterday's statement that actually capital for the science budget has been dramatically reduced. The near cash part, if you like, the recurrent or revenue expenditure, has escaped much better than we thought it was going to, but capital is going to be under tremendous pressure. And those institutions that have strong balances now will be in a much better position to weather the storm, to continue to invest strategically. So I think some institutions are going to be allowed to fail, and as I said before, absorbed with incentives into other institutions, and there will be pressure to rationalise in order to continue to provide quality courses in particular areas. So those institutions that took a punt, I've called it here, in the last REE, I think are going to come unstuck. They'll find that they've already found that they couldn't recover income from those investments that they made to boost their REE position, and that they will now find that there isn't a way of actually recovering that investment. And I think there's going to be some tricky decisions for England. It'll be interesting to see what happens in Scotland, which way you go in response to the Brown proposals. But tricky decisions for England about pricing of courses. It is not, and never has been, the thought that all courses will suddenly become 12K. That is unsustainable. You won't get any students if you do that. And in some areas, you might have to put the price down and cross-subsidise internally. So it is not a given that tuition fees simply go through the roof as soon as you take the cap off. That cannot be the case. It is a proper market. So a falling unitary resource and falling numbers, which could happen in some institutions if others expand and take those students away, is a toxic mix, and that's how institutions can fail very quickly, which takes me back to the point I made about the need to respond dynamically and quickly to changing staffing situations. So, my take on how to survive in the last few minutes I've got. Well, develop a real strategic plan, Vice Principal. So there are absolutely drivers. You mustn't have just a woolly strategic plan. It's got to be meaningful and deliverable. It's not arm waving, because it's going to matter. The future of your institution depends on it. I think you want to cut out lower quality courses. But no one really likes doing that, because you like to have as broad a university as you can. But if you don't concentrate on your strengths, you are vulnerable in a more dynamic market. And I'm afraid cutting corresponding staff quickly rather than taking years to do it. Know your true place in the market, not where you'd like to be. So we all would like to be at the top. Regrettably, we're not. But if you recognise your real place, then you're more likely to come up with the right strategic plan. Create an operating surplus by rigorous cost reduction. You really have to look at everything you do and see if you can drive the cost out of the system. Because that way, you've got an operating system, surplus, your back is not to the wall. You've got some money to invest. Don't be tempted to borrow to buy time, and which some institutions are already doing. Because they can see the timescale for change is long, they're borrowing money. That is increasing your cost base and not a good long-term solution. Well, you've heard what I've said about changing charter and statutes. If you have to, if you can do it without, fine. But actually look at how dynamic you can be in relation to a changing marketplace. Focus on your strengths and avoid equal misery. Again, a personal view. If you simply apply the cuts everywhere to everybody, you're unlikely to be competitive in the subjects where it really matters. Look for partnership and trade provision between institutions. Actually, in this, if you've got a neighbouring institution, be willing to give up your smaller or less good part to them in return for something else that you want to develop coming to you. So it's understanding where you are and what you might be able to do becomes important. Develop an affordable estate strategy. So brackets, aspiration on hold. We'd all like to have a fantastic new building for this, that and the other. And of course it was in our original estate strategies, but you're unlikely to have the money to do that. So be realistic about what you can actually achieve. Ensure that the leadership team is very visible and engaged internally. What staff don't like is not being able to see the Vice-Chancellor. That couldn't be the case here. He's with us here this afternoon. But in some institutions, there's a remoteness between the senior team and the staff. The senior team must be engaged, picking up the groundswell, looking for opportunities and so on. Not all wisdom sits in the senior management team. You have it around the institutions. Make sure you communicate it up to the people that have got to make the decisions. Remember, it is possible to win in what I've called a bear market, using a financial sector term. A falling market, you can still win. My conclusions. So despite our outstanding success, we are frequently criticised, and there I think some of the media do not help us. It's detrimental to our international competitive position. I do question whether the Times Higher new international league table that basically saw all UK university, the average UK university position slipping down, was terribly helpful for the UK. Might have been jolly great fun to actually have people moving around in that, so that they can sell more copies. Not actually terribly helpful to the UK. Can you imagine the French doing that? Producing a league table that showed French universities dropping down? I don't think so. So somehow we need to point that out. There's going to be less money on the way for both teaching and research. There'll be a real terms decrease in the resources available from now at least until 2014, because remember, tuition fees take time to come in. Even if they start in England in 2012, then it takes time for those to feed through into the system, and it depends on the rate at which the teaching grant is being withdrawn. So I can't see that increasing, and we already know that flat cash is what's happening on the research side at best, and that's effectively inflation reduction every year. So less resources available. It's likely that fees will be increased in England, and I'm looking forward to our discussions to what you think is going to happen in Scotland. But if Scotland doesn't increase its expenditure per student, then it's in danger, potentially, of being left behind by some English institutions, as they charge above where their unit of resource is now. And effectively, if you accept my premise that there is a connection between quality and expenditure, there is a danger that the elite English universities pull away from Scotland if Scotland is not able to respond, either with public money, which will be fine, or with tuition fees in some form or another. Because that would mean that Scotland essentially treads water. It might well be treading water in the middle ground, because some English institutions will suffer in the regime that's proposed. They will drop down, their unit of resource effectively will fall, and they'll be in deep trouble, so they will go down. So it may well be that the top in England goes ahead, Scotland stays where it is, and the bottom in England moves below. That's merely supposition. So challenging times ahead. Alumni fundraising, and I've badged it green, will generate significantly more funds. And I think there's plenty of evidence that is actually happening now. Really, really good. Staff pay, staff numbers and infrastructure, I'm afraid, are all going to worsen. I'm not here, of course, but I suspect that nationally that will be the case. And, of course, a significant gap will open up between the UK and the USA expenditure per student. There's already a big gap, but unless the tuition fee can rise, is allowed to rise in England significantly for more than just a few institutions, then we're going to damage our position relative to the USA. So my conclusion, Scotland has some difficult decisions to make for the Scottish Government, and of course for institutions as well, how to respond to what is likely to be a very dynamic situation happening in England. So HE management has always been interesting, but I can tell you retirement's jolly good. Thank you very much. Do you want me to stay up the front, or are we going to do questions at the end, whichever you like?
Shall we just take a couple of...
Yes, of course. Yes.
Michael, thank you very much. A tour de force. That managed to be challenging, frank, very frank at a number of points, exhilarating, and in many ways totally terrifying. Clearly the situation in England is going to change. It's going to change dramatically. In Scotland, we have some difficult decisions to think about. Before Christopher starts, just a couple of questions for Michael. David.
Michael, thank you very much. I really enjoyed that. I'll say my name for the purpose of the audio recording. The 2004 Higher Education Act did not have the same effect in Scotland as it did in England. So there are no universities in Scotland that could exist without having postgraduate degree awarding powers. But absolutely they do exist in England. But I didn't want to focus on that. That's just a difference between the two countries, which is not widely appreciated. I think I would agree with what we need to do, absolutely. It's also absolutely not clear about what's going to happen over how Scotland is able to raise the sorts of resources that it needs in order to keep the quality of provision in teaching and in research at an adequate level, and of course to provide better evidence to our partners and to government about the true economic value of universities in leading to prosperity in the future in a global market now which is increasingly competitive. I think these are some really big challenges, and I think the debate will begin in Scotland very soon. I think the good thing about the Scottish response is that it's likely to be very collaborative and joined up in looking for a solution, to how to move forward. But I think the other issue is that we've only just had, if you like, confirmation of the fact that the science spend is not being decimated as well as late as only yesterday. But nevertheless, a real decrease in spending power against what's happening in Germany and the States and France, where they're increasing it massively. So the competitive position of Britain, whatever we do, even if we get this right, is going to be very badly challenged.
Yes.
Thanks very much.
I agree. I agree with that. And one of the things that we've been looking at is how to respond to this sort of world. And will universities, probably less so in Scotland but in England, choose to try and go private in the way in which North American institutions have? And I gather there's one view in Scotland, one person who shares that view, that actually the private world looks likely, but probably less likely in Scotland than it does in England. But if you look at Brown proposals and analyse, would it? I mean, I'm assuming that everybody's seen the Brown proposals, so forgive me if you haven't. I'll explain them. But essentially, there is a tax on any tuition fee that you set above a threshold level of £6,000, and it's a progressive tax. The more you charge, the greater the tax proportionately. Now, of course, as you charge more, you get more revenue. And what is that there is a possible balance point, and this is, I'm sure people are doing the sums as we speak, between going private and not taking up the government offered loans or postulated loans according to Brown, and where it's going to be at a government rate. So let's assume that's 1% below the market rate for the real rate of interest. Then there is clearly, if a university were to say to the students, prospective students, we will give you the same terms as a government loan. In other words, we will subsidise from our own resources that extra 1% of interest over a 30-year loan, and then you have to make assumptions about what that loan actually is, how long it lasts, and so on. But we will do that, but we will therefore not pay the tax. We will be independent. Its back of the envelope says that breakpoint is actually quite low. You can effectively cost justify not taking state loans and the restrictions that go with that, and funding the loans on the same basis as for students coming through a loan system, and still make money, and make more money, and the more higher fee you charge, the more you make. So it then becomes effectively a straight market situation. Will the market bear the cost you're proposing to charge? And in some cases it won't, and we know it won't. In other cases it will, and more than is currently charged. So it's a really very interesting period, and to be 20 years younger and running an institution. But David, thank you.
Talking of which, Principal.
Mike, thank you very much. And the Survivor's Guide for the next decade was very much appreciated, and something, as you know, we're trying to acknowledge and adhere to here at Strathclyde. One or two things I'd like to reinforce and use in slightly different language. I noticed James and one or two other colleagues of mine who've been standing shoulder to shoulder in the past few months trying to reset the University of Scotland position in discussion with Scottish ministers, but I won't say too much about that because we're currently in a state of flux, not in terms of our position, but in terms of the Scottish Government's absorption of what they heard yesterday and how they're reacting to it over the next month. But one thing we have to do is understand that innovation is going to be required in this sector. That's an important word for me. It's often used, but very often fully interpreted properly. So the status quo for us is not possible. Very few institutions in the UK will continue with business as usual, but the vast bulk of universities are going to have to innovate, not only academically, certainly academically, the way that we conduct research, provide our teaching, and continue to enhance the student experience. And I know there are a few students in the room today who should take the full courage of their convictions and contribute to this discussion as they see fit. But we have to innovate, and we have to remain aware of each other, and where we can possibly partner each other, let's do it. Now that requires a degree of trust in our system that hasn't traditionally been there. There's going to be a degree of give and take both within and across institutions. But as well as the privatisation opportunity that you correctly pointed out, I think we have to continue to assert the value of higher education in society. From a society's perspective, value, culture, and of course, contribution to economic recovery. And privately, every politician will concede, and you know who I was with at lunchtime today, will concede that we are a key part of the drivers to take us back into a better position over the next 5 or 10 years. But what we also have to do is to start working with private sector partners, not necessarily to fully privatise sections of our work, but have them, or remind them, it's not about taking the outputs of universities in terms of our students and our research. We must have them realise they must join us at the front of this process as well, in terms of investment, funding for our students, and funding for infrastructure, which, if it does deteriorate at the worst end of the broadband that you and I have talked about, will be detrimental to UK competitiveness.
Yes.
So there is a fundamental strategic argument there to be had with the private sector, as well as us continue to assert a strong position from the public sector funding.
Absolutely, and STEM is a key part of that. Not the only part, of course, and no one would argue for a STEM-only higher education system, but the pressure that's going to be on non-STEM subjects in England, if those proposals are adopted, will be quite intense, actually. I think I would be quite disappointed, actually, with the outcome if I were in those subject areas. And as I tried to indicate, any country does need to have excellent STEM provision, because a lot of the innovation in market products that you can sell for foreign exchange essentially is coming in those areas. So if you fail in those areas, then that brings pressure on the whole of the subject base that you're trying to support. So getting the balance right is important, and making sure that if England does go down this track, that actually it doesn't disturb what Scotland wants to do. But your situation is quite difficult as I would see it, because you have to persuade your government either to come up with the extra money to match what's happening, so that you don't lose out in the unit of resource comparisons, or move to some sort of tuition fee, which politically is going to be, as I understand, quite difficult in Scotland. So there are some difficult choices for you.
Indeed there are. Good. Thank you both for those questions. It's time to move on to the next presentation, and it's a pleasure to me to welcome to the podium, once he's got his microphone on.
Welcome me whilst I have got my microphone on, just so I will be able to audibly say thank you.